Alan Miller completed his PhD in sociology from the University of Washington in 1991 and promptly moved across the country to the University of North Carolina in Charlotte for 2 years. He then spent 3 more years at Florida State University, where he was when this article was published. In 1996, he moved on again, this time to Hokkaido University in Japan, where he remained for the next 7 years until he died of cancer at the age of only 47. John Hoffmann grew up in Virginia, where he graduated from James Madison University before earning a PhD in criminal justice from SUNY Albany in 1991, followed by a master's in public health from Emory University in 1994. He went to work at the National Opinion Research Center in Chicago, analyzing data on substance abuse and mental health for the next 5 years. He had just arrived at NORC when he collaborated with Miller on this article. In 1999, he joined the sociology department at Brigham Young University, where he has remained for the rest of his career. This article introduces the widely observed difference in religiosity of women compared to men in many different cultures, and discusses how we might think about this pattern in relation to other psychological orientations beyond just gender identities. Discussions of the personal side of religion for individuals so far has considered both gradual childhood socialization and more abrupt adult conversions as rather generic processes, happening in pretty much the same way for all people who experience them. In the same way, when looking at large-scale institutional variations between church, sect, and denominations, no consideration was given so far to differences in either beliefs or behavior for the individual people in these groups. All members of sects have been treated as similar and interchangeable, perhaps summed up by some kind of picture of the average member of different groups. But this is like knowing only that a river on average is 3 feet deep. This doesn't mean that you can walk across from one bank to the other. We turn now to look at one of several ways in which different individuals experience religion differently, even when they all might be the same age or belong to the same religious group. One well-known and well-studied pattern that emerges when we look into these personal differences concerns gendered religious experiences. As Miller and Hoffmann demonstrate in this article, there is strong empirical evidence to support the everyday folk wisdom that women tend to be more religious than men. For example, the nationally representative General Social Survey asks a lot of questions about religion. After asking with what religion each person identifies, a follow-up question is asked of everybody who mentions any religion. It asks whether that person feels like a strong, somewhat strong, or not very strong member of that religion. This question has been asked every year for over 40 years, and the answers always show a higher share of women who say they are strong members and a higher share of men who say they are not very strong members of a religion. This same result appears in many different studies and surveys, so Miller and Hoffmann ask a basic question. Why do the answers come out this way? Before we consider their attempt to answer the question, we should be clear that their focus is on what people tell a survey interviewer about their personal lives. We can't get at what they actually believe or feel. We can only hope that the answers they provide on these surveys give us some insight into what is actually going on in their hearts and minds. This is always a problem in all social research. The interesting twist that Miller and Hoffmann introduce into this question adds a second important idea to help us understand the first idea of differences in religiosity. The second idea concerns how willing you are to take risks in your life, and is linked to religiosity most famously by an example first proposed by Blaise Pascal. Pascal, a French mathematician, theologian, and physicist, lived a brief life of only about 40 years in the middle of the 1600s, about the same time that the first European colonies were being established in North America. Pascal offered us two different versions of reality, one where God exists and one where God doesn't exist. Then he asked what happens if you believe in God or don't believe and live your life accordingly. If God exists and you believe it, you go to heaven. If God exists and you don't believe, you go to hell. If God doesn't exist and you believe it anyway, you may miss some good parties, but you haven't lost much. If God doesn't exist and you don't believe it, you may go to more of those parties, but you haven't gained much either. So Pascal says it is only logical and rational to bet that God exists, because the gains and losses are much greater if this is true. If you don't like to take risks, you believe in God. If you enjoy taking risks, you toss God out and go to the parties. If people actually might think like this, then the risk-averse people out there will take Pascal's bet and believe in God. The risk takers will be more likely to doubt God and risk doing all the stuff that religion says they shouldn't do. From this angle, we would expect more women to be more risk-averse and more men should be greater risk takers. This also turns out to be supported by quite a bit of empirical evidence, whether we look at parachute jumping, motorcycle racing, smoking and drinking, or saving for retirement. Women apparently tend more often to be more risk-averse than men. Could this, wonder Miller and Hoffmann, help to explain why women are also more religious, or women going along with Pascal's wager? Before they start digging into any empirical data to test their hypothesis, they fill in the background of this picture more completely. It is one thing to look at the surface pattern of facts and see that women tend to be more risk-averse. It is another thing to decide why this pattern exists at all. Miller and Hoffmann consider three possible pieces of the social puzzle that might explain women's greater aversion to taking risks. First, we can just look at how we treat little boys and girls. One observer noted that parents try to protect little girls from dangers in the world around them, while they tend to try to protect that world around them from the damage that might be inflicted on it by little boys. We expect little boys to take risks and little girls to be careful, and people generally turn out to be what we expect from them. On the other hand, even if we were to discount or eliminate differences in socialization, the facts of life in everyday adulthood continue to proclaim that when it comes to social power and advantage, it is still a man's world. Although changes are going on all around us, men still make more money than women and occupy a lot of the high ground in politics, the economy, and of course in religions too. These differences in social position encourage men to take more risks because the potential rewards for them are greater, and encourage women to be more careful because they also have to watch out more often for children in their care, and the potential dangers are greater if things fall apart in their lives. Of course, these patterns of social position also might be traced back partly to the different patterns of socialization, so the two explanations remain linked together. Finally, however, some scholars have suggested that risk-taking may partly just be hardwired into the male animal more than into females. This applies not only to human beings, but also possibly to sea lions, birds, and all kinds of other animals. To help them face these risks and competition, male animals in many species show much higher levels of circulating testosterone in their bloodstreams, getting them all worked up to take all kinds of risky chances in life. The same innate tendencies that cause male bighorn sheep to bang their heads together, or brightly colored male cardinals to lead a predatory hawk away from the nest, might also lead male humans to reject Pascal's wager and put less emphasis on religion in their lives. These are all interesting possible explanations for women's greater religiosity, but Miller and Hoffmann know that they can't just throw these ideas out there. Once they bring it up, they have to go and find some evidence to decide which, if any, of these explanations might actually be at work in the world. Faced with the challenge of finding some evidence to test their various explanations, Miller and Hoffmann decide to turn to the results of a nationally representative survey conducted among 2,400 student respondents attending 135 different schools all around the United States. This national survey can allow them to examine at least some of the explanations they've considered for women being more religious than men. For example, by looking at these young people early in their lives, while they are still in school and living with their parents, they can skip the whole question of how social position in adulthood might reflect religiosity and risk-taking. These students haven't gotten that far yet. The survey also provides some information about parents that might get at the issue of childhood socialization. This information only tells us how much education had been completed by each student's mother and father, not anything about the parents' religious beliefs or anything directly about religious socialization. But Miller and Hoffmann explained that more educated parents usually tend to score lower on various measures of religiosity, and they wonder whether this will rub off on the students themselves. For good measure, they also include the race of each student in the analysis, because we know, as we will see in a later section, that religion plays a more prominent part in the social worlds of some ethnic groups than for others. Similarly, they divide these students into two groups who live in urban versus rural areas and consider each group separately. All of these controls allow them to rule out any such differences as possible explanations for the patterns they observe in their analysis. One reason that they chose this particular Monitoring the Future survey dataset to study is that it asks questions that they wanted about the religious identities of the students. While many studies count reported behavior, especially frequency of going to church services, in order to measure religious involvement, this time Miller and Hoffmann declare that they are more interested in attitudes than in actions. They want to know about the inner psychological aspects of students' religious lives. As long as we remember that we can never really measure such inner mental states, and that all we have are some answers given to an interviewer, which we hope will tell us something about those mental states, we can go ahead with this. If you code the strong religious answer as a 5 and then step down until the lowest none response gets a score of 1, it turns out that for these 2,400 students, the average score for girls was 2.83, significantly higher than the average of 2.59 recorded for boys. Here again, we find an example of greater religiosity among girls than among boys, just as in a lot of other research. An even more important reason that Miller and Hoffmann wanted to use this Monitoring the Future survey is that these students also were asked some questions about risk-taking behavior, something that gets included in such questionnaires much less frequently. In fact, there are all kinds of risky questions in this survey, including questions about both attitudes and behavior related to things like premarital sex, smoking and drinking, using illegal drugs, and lots of other risk-taking. Miller and Hoffmann have to leave out a lot of these questions because many of them involve things that by definition go against the teachings of most organized religions. If we found more religious students disapproving of such things more often, this would not be an earth-shaking discovery and would not do much to test the explanations that they're exploring. So they settle on two more neutral and abstract questions that do get at the idea of taking risks, but that don't include any kind of implied moral judgment. These are risks that you can take without incurring the wrath of God. One question asked how much students would want to have adventurous new experiences, and the other asked about how afraid they would be of dangerous situations. Combining these two 5-point questions, the maximum for wanting dangerous adventures would be a score of 10, while the minimum for thinking that adventures are nasty, dangerous things that make you late for dinner would be a score of 2. This time we discovered that the risk-taking score averages only 5.49 for girls in the sample, significantly lower than the average of 6.84 observed for boys. Boys are more willing to take risks than girls in this sample, again, as in a lot of other research. Since this obviously is the opposite of the pattern for religiosity, it looks like we may have a good explanation going here. Again, though, we can't be sure just because these averages go in opposite directions on the two measures. There could be girls who are way above average on risk-taking who also turn out to be more religious than some of the girls who don't like risks. There could also be boys who don't like taking risks, but who are not interested at all in religion either. To see whether these two surface patterns match up when we look beneath the surface of the survey at the responses of each individual student, we have to move ahead to the detailed analysis conducted by Miller and Hoffmann. The heart of the evidence uncovered by Miller and Hoffmann appears in Table 3 in their article. The first column of numbers in this table, labeled Model 1, shows a constant score of about 2.5 at the bottom of the column. This is the average religiosity score for the reference category of students to which they compare everybody else. The reference category includes students who were white, male, lived in urban areas, and whose mothers and fathers had average levels of education. A score of 2.5 would put them right in the middle of the 5-point religiosity scale. Actually, we need not have bothered to worry about urban versus rural context because the separate coefficient for rural is only a tiny 0.001 2.088, meaning that instead of an urban average of 2.5, the rural average would be 2.588. This is not a significant difference. The effects of more education for mothers and fathers is negative, as we might expect, meaning more educated parents have less religious children. But again, these differences are even tinier than for the urban-rural difference, and again are not significant. By comparison, the effects for race and sex are huge. Even after accounting for the other possible effects, the expected score for girls is 0.2 higher than for the boys in the comparison group, or 2.7 instead of 2.5. This difference is statistically significant in the sample. The expected difference for being black instead of white turns out to be the largest of all. Instead of an expected average of 2.5 on the religiosity scale, black male students would average 3.173, more than 2/3 of a point higher on the scale. The estimate for black female students would combine both sex and race coefficients, predicting an average of 3.373 compared to 2.5 for the white male students. Miller and Hoffmann don't do anything with this dramatic race difference, but we'll come back to that one day soon. They do pay attention to the big increase in predicted religiosity scores for girls compared to boys. This means that for individual students, as well as for the sample as a whole, girls tend to have higher religiosity scores than do boys. But their punchline does not appear until they add Model 2 to this table. The new item in this second column adds another predictor and another coefficient, the score on the two combined adventure and danger questions. When we take account of these scores, they also reveal a significant link to religiosity. Each higher score on the risk measure predicts a negative drop of 0.058 in religiosity. Since this is a 10-point scale, the difference between the lowest and the highest scores is a full half point on the religiosity measure, with the risk takers significantly less religious than the risk-averse. Since we already know that girls had lower risk-taking scores than boys, once we take these scores into account, this is bound to affect the original estimate of the importance of gender itself. We can see this at the top of that second column, where the coefficient for being female has been cut nearly in half from 0.200 to only 0.124. Half of the effect of being female has disappeared if we consider boys and girls who score about the same on risk-taking. By comparison, hardly any of the difference in religiosity for black compared to white students disappears. Risk-taking attitudes have little or nothing to do with that contrast. The effects of parents' educations and living in cities remain non-effects. Of course, both risk-taking and religiosity are just measures based on attitudes expressed in response to these survey questions. Saying that one attitude causes the other is always a little strange in a situation like this. We might defend the idea that the risk-taking attitude is probably determined earlier in life than the attitude about religion, so we might argue for a causal arrow from risk-taking to religiosity. But Miller and Hoffmann have to admit that the arrow might as well run the other way, so that if you become very religious, that might change you and make you more risk-averse. To check on this, they redo the analysis as shown in Table 3. But instead of religiosity as the outcome to be predicted, with a constant at the bottom of the columns for the reference group, they use the risk-taking score as the outcome to be predicted. They don't show us this alternative table, but they do report that when they put religiosity in as the added variable in Model 2, it only changes the lower risk-taking score estimated for girls from minus 0.41 to minus 0.39, an insignificant effect. This article then does suggest that the whole idea of Pascal's wager and the idea that religiosity might be a kind of risk aversion is worth keeping in mind. It apparently helps to explain about half of the higher religiosity observed among girls than among boys, at least in this student sample. But this only pushes the fundamental question back one step. We know that being more risk-averse apparently explains part of women's greater religiosity, but we don't know why the women are more risk-averse in the first place. We still face the three alternatives mentioned earlier in the article. Do we teach little girls to be more risk-averse? Do women rationally avoid risks in adulthood because they have less to gain and more to lose from taking risks? Is there some more fundamental biological incentive toward risk-taking in males of the species? This article does not sort out these issues. There's still a lot of work to do on this question. You might someday move us further ahead in this frontier of research. For example, you could notice that socialization patterns for bringing up little girls and boys may have been changing in American society in recent decades. Or maybe these socialization patterns are different for different subgroups in the population. If you could find surveys asking these different kids questions about risk-taking and religion, you might come up with new comparisons to show whether different treatment of children has something to do with how religious each of us become. Similarly, the gender boundaries between work and home, and even between different occupations in the world of work, also have been shifting. If we move our analysis later into the life course, beyond students in schools, you might be able to find data someday on the risk-taking and religious attitudes of men and women in different occupations. Do profiles for these attitudes converge between men and women when they do the same jobs or when they stay at home with children? Or do the gender contrasts observed by Miller and Hoffmann persist no matter what these people are doing? Is this contrast nature or nurture? For now, we have to settle for a question mark, but you may be the one to answer this question one day.